Okay, thanks very much everyone for coming back so promptly from your break. I'm Cassia Rowland. I'm a senior researcher here at the Institute for Government, and I specialise in criminal justice. So one of the government's core missions is delivering safer streets, but this is threatened by a criminal justice system that's facing really severe challenges, whether that's declining confidence in the police, rocketing backlogs in the criminal courts, an overflowing prison system, and a probation service that seems stuck in a downward spiral. Since coming to power, the Labour government has faced serious riots, released around 5,500 prisoners early, and announced a sentencing review, the creation of a women's justice board, as well as new measures to support victims of violence against women and girls. The recent budget increased funding for the Ministry of Justice, but will the government be able to get to grips with the crisis? So joining me to talk about all of these issues and more is this fantastic panel. So we've got Lord Timpson, Minister of State for Prisons and Probation, former chair of the Prison Reform Trust and former CEO of the Timpson Group. We've got Penelope Gibbs, CEO of Transform Justice, a charity working to increase fairness and transparency in the justice system and reduce crime and reoffending, as well as Dr. Karen Schucan, Associate Professor in Social and Political Science at UCL, with a particular expertise on domestic abuse and community responses. Neil Basu, who was meant to join us today, unfortunately couldn't make it, but he's given me some hints on things he wants to make sure we cover, so we'll get onto those. So each of our speakers will make some opening remarks. I'll then ask some follow-up questions before taking questions from the audience. If you've got a question for any of our speakers, raise your hand if you're here in person, or submit them using the Q&A function if you're joining us online. You can submit them whilst we're speaking, and I'll try and get to as many of them as possible. So with that said, we're going to dive straight into our opening remarks. James, would you like to...
Good afternoon, everybody. Just good afternoon. It won't surprise you that my answer to the question, the criminal justice system, is there a way to fix it, is a resounding yes. That's not to say that I think it will be easy or that it will be quick, but we've made a start, and that's where I'd like to focus today. When we came into government, our prisons were in crisis, full to breaking point. And at one point, we had fewer than 100 prison places left in the men's estate. In those circumstances, our hard-working prison staff are operating on the wrong side of what is safe, just trying to get through each day without tensions erupting in violence, which makes it next to impossible to turn offenders' lives around. That is clear because 80% of offending in our country is reoffending. The offenders I met and employed when I was the CEO of Timpson Group were desperate for a second chance, but could only seize it with the right help. Our prison staff need the bandwidth to educate and to train them to find jobs. And we know how important that is because offenders who get jobs within a year of release are much less likely to reoffend, which cuts crime, protects the public, and reduces the huge £22 billion a year cost of reoffending. That's high stakes enough as it is, and there is so much I want to do in the prison and probation over the next 5 years, on standards, on technology, on expanding our partnerships with employers. But returning to prison capacity, had we run out of space in our prisons entirely, the consequences would have been dire. Police unable to make arrests and trials put on hold, a total breakdown in law and order. We could not countenance that, so we took immediate steps to release some offenders earlier than they otherwise would have been, freeing up space for more dangerous offenders. For now, we prevented a total collapse of the system, but it is only for now. If we continue as we are, our prisons will continue to fill up. Part of the solution is, of course, prison building, but we must be honest about the extent of this crisis. Every year, the prison population grows by around 4,500 offenders. So we need to build about the equivalent of HMP Risley, near where I live in Cheshire, 4.5 times every year just to keep up with demand. The reality is that we cannot build our way out of trouble. We need a new approach. That's why we've launched a review of sentencing with one clear goal: to make sure we always have enough space in prisons. The review will follow 3 principles. First, sentences must punish offenders and protect the public, because public safety comes first and there will always be violent offenders we must put into custody. The review's second principle is that sentences must encourage offenders to change their ways. In Texas, they introduced good behaviour credits, so well-behaved prisoners could earn time off their sentences by engaging with rehabilitation. We want to learn from efforts like that and wherever they could help us bring down the prison population here. The third principle of the review is that we must expand the punishments available for offenders outside prison. We already use GPS tags to put some criminals under effective house arrest with 12-hour curfews every day. And sobriety tags can measure offenders' sweat every 30 minutes with a 97% compliance rate. The reviewers have been asked to look at the technology currently on offer here and what's available in other countries to see what more we can do to punish offenders in the community. And the evidence is clear that those who serve their sentences outside prison are much less likely to reoffend than those who serve short sentences inside prison. We're delighted that the review will be led by David Gauke, a former Lord Chancellor, hugely well respected right across the justice system. He and his team of expert reviewers will take a bipartisan and evidence-based look at an issue that has been a political football for far too long. The review will report back in the spring, and we look forward to acting on its recommendations so that we can finally tackle the prison capacity crisis once and for all, to ensure that no government ever has to take the emergency measures that we were forced to, and enable the system to get better offender outcomes, both inside prisons and out in the community, which cuts crime and means fewer victims. Can we fix the criminal justice system? Yes, I think so, and addressing prison capacity is a crucial part of how we do it. But I realise it is just one part, and there are a range of issues that I haven't even touched on, like probation, court backlogs, conviction rates, leadership, culture, training, recruitment, buildings fit for purpose, standards. I could go on. I hope we can explore them as part of the Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Next we have Penelope.
Hi, I'm going to give you 4 quick solutions to the crisis that we have, looking at both. The main ones are prison capacity, and the other one is about the court's backlog as well. And I agree with everything that James said about prison capacity and the issues there, but what I would say is, as part of the sentencing review, what we have to look ahead to is being very, very brave. Because in terms of the prison population at the moment, there's actually been a reduction in the number of prisoners who are serving sentences under 10 years. The major change has been in those serving an over 10-year sentence. So when we're looking at the sentencing review, we can try and phase out short prison sentences, but it won't make much difference to the numbers. The big numbers come from those much higher sentences, which are inevitably going to be for some quite serious crimes. But the fact is, there is no evidence that somebody doing 11 years rather than 9 years is any more effective. And so there's a big job for the government to do. It's easy to do the review and bring up these recommendations. The challenge will be about selling them in to the media and the public. I think the other thing is looking at the court backlog, and there are no easy answers there. But what I would say is, if you look at the Magistrates' Court, where there is a significant backlog as well as the Crown Court, let's shrink it. Let's take the bottom layer out of the Magistrates' Court. I don't know if any of you have gone to look at your local Magistrates' Court, but it's really well worth doing. Because at the bottom level, the sentence that is most used in the Magistrates' Court is the fine. So people are convicted and sentenced to pay a fine. They either don't pay it, really struggle to pay it, or commit more crime to pay it. It is not rehabilitative. So it has its place, but there are thousands of people going through the Magistrates' Court who get fines, who could be better dealt with by the police out of court. So the police can already use things called cautions and community resolutions, which have rehabilitative programs attached. So for the very same crime, say shoplifting, you could get the police to send somebody on a program, maybe a drug-related program, since most of them have got addiction issues, rather than go to court and just be fined, which is not very helpful and just increases the magistrate court backlog. So we think at least 10% could be taken out of the magistrates court altogether and more effectively dealt with by the police. Looking at something completely different in terms of rehabilitation, and actually the reoffending rate is lower if you take it out of court and give a caution, we need to make rehabilitation of our people who've been involved in the justice system a reality. And James did amazing work for Timpson's in terms of people leaving prison and supporting them into employment and long-term jobs. But actually, most of the people in our country who have criminal records did not go to prison. And we now have the most astonishing situation where 1 in 4 of the population has a criminal record. And that was an MOJ press release the other day. That criminal record is a barrier to employment, to housing, to education, etc. And we now have a system where you can be involved in a fight outside a college, age 18, and that offence will come up on a DBS enhanced check when you want to volunteer at a children's school when you're age 50. Is that proportionate? So we're not saying get rid of the criminal record system, but we are saying, can we make it a bit more proportionate and tweak it a bit to enable, to boost social mobility and employment chances for everybody who's got a criminal record, not just for people who've been released from prison. And lastly, it's been mentioned before, localisation, devolution. This is one of the most centralised systems we have in government, and it works really badly. Most of the drivers to crime are outside the criminal justice system and the sanctions it involves. So the only way in the end of resolving reoffending is to join up with local services, which is not working very well at the moment.
Great, thanks very much. And that leaves us just with Karen, last but not least.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to zoom out as well and kind of focus on how we improve the criminal justice system through the perspective of domestic abuse. I think that has wider application to draw out some learning and broader themes. So firstly, we welcome the targets. The government has set ambitious targets, as we all know, to halve violence against women and girls in the next decade, and have declared this issue to be a national emergency as part of their broader Safer Streets mission. So this is all fantastic. But the current initiatives that have been advanced are primarily focused on quite a narrow focus on policing and the criminal justice system. So, for example, we've heard a lot about the specialists that will be located in 999 control rooms, which is obviously fantastic and much needed, but arguably we need to take a broader view of this issue, domestic abuse, to better resolve and address this issue. So what I'm arguing for is a more holistic whole systems approach that firstly integrates public services with communities to maximise early intervention and improve responses to this issue. Secondly, I think there's a case to work across the public and the private sector to drive prevention and improve responses. And lastly, I think we need to really embed collaboration with victim survivors, but also those localised specialist agencies that have such valuable knowledge and operation within local contexts. So firstly, integrating public services with communities means recognising the vital role that informal networks and communities are playing in responding to domestic abuse and in that early identification of abuse. So the majority of victims do not report the abusive relationship to the police, whereas our whole system is set up on the basis that the police are the first responders. So the crime survey from 2023 reported that 53% of victims told a friend, 46% told a family member, but only 18% told the police. So public services need to really integrate with communities to harness this window of opportunity to respond and intervene at an earlier stage. There are actually few initiatives that we can really point to in the policy domain that try to do this beyond public awareness raising campaigns. So the Enough campaign, for example, is trying to galvanise public responses to abuse and to encourage the public to challenge abuse. Okay, but beyond that, there are a few kind of initiatives that we can point to that have been supported by policy change. Secondly, if we want to look at how we can work across the public and private sectors, here we're talking about focusing on the root causes of violence against women and girls, and this arguably warrants a cross-sectoral approach. So here we're talking about including education sectors, the health sectors, potentially the private sector and businesses as well. So research highlights the effectiveness of educational interventions in reducing violence and abuse in young people. Arguably, these types of interventions where there is evidence of effect could potentially be strengthened, rolled out beyond simply the school sector into community settings, potentially higher education. And my own work has highlighted the value of training and education within workplaces and the role that the private sector have in upping their game and being able to respond more effectively to domestic abuse and taking it on as their responsibility to do so. Lastly, I think it's so critical that we centre victim survivor perspectives in this journey and in guiding our policy and our moves forward. This also means embedding collaboration with those specialist services that are working so hard under very difficult funding circumstances to deliver immediate services to victim survivors when the criminal justice system is unable to do so, but also in moving forward and generating more long-term plans and initiative to respond to this crisis and meet this long-term aim, this 10-year aim of reducing violence against women and girls in 10 years.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to particularly thank everyone for keeping to such good time, which is unusual. So my first question is for you, James. We've heard a lot about the situation in prisons and how severe that is. Improving conditions in prisons is likely to rely very heavily on the probation service. But probation is itself facing some really serious performance challenges. Nearly half of probation delivery units were assessed as inadequate in 2022-23. Why do you think probation is struggling so much? Is this hangover from the kind of division and reunification process, or do we think there's something else going on?
I think it's really complex. I spent quite a lot of time with probation delivery units since I started the job. I've met so many amazing people, dedicated, talented, hardworking, but they're up against it. One of the things that I believe passionately is that probation officers want to spend more time face-to-face with offenders rather than filling out forms, often the same form over and over again 15 times a day. So there are a number of things I think we need to look at. But if you look back at why we're in this problem, we're recruiting an extra 1,000 probation officers. We need more staff. But it will take time for them to be trained and for them to learn the complexities of the job, because it's not something you can just give someone a textbook and say, now you've learnt it. This is about how you build relationships and confidence and understand the complexities of what is often the most complex people in the country. So I am really confident that we will be able to turn things around. It's going to take time, and there are a number of things we need to look at. It'll be interesting to see where the sentencing review goes and how that impacts the role of probation and the resources that they will need. But I'm a big believer in technology as well, and how technology can support probation's work, not just in reducing the amount of admin and copying and pasting they need to do, but also how we can manage offenders with electronic monitoring. And I'm going out to Spain in a few weeks' time to have a look what they're doing there on electronic monitoring. So there's a lot to learn, but I'm hugely impressed by the talent and passion of the team. But I also recognise that they are dealing with a really difficult situation.
I'll just touch on something Penelope mentioned about the kind of more local approach. And do you think that a more localised approach to probation would help or harm the service?
Well, I think there are good examples around the country of different models that work really well. So I'm a Mancunian, and so before I was doing this job, we used to do quite a lot with Andy Burnham's team on homelessness and linking them up with employers, part of our employment advisory boards, and that worked really well. But I think what probation needs is not another revolution. What it needs is calm, thoughtful, evidence-based reform that is going to help them do the job they really want to do really well.
Yeah. And you mentioned working across different kind of services, and obviously you're not just responsible for prisons and probation, but also reducing reoffending. That's kind of a new part that's specifically...
I managed to get that one on my job title.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the levers to reduce reoffending sit outside the Ministry of Justice, as we've heard from our panellists already. How do you see kind of your role working across departments to try and drive that reducing reoffending agenda?
It's absolutely vital. If we don't get that right, it's not going to work. So, for example, this morning I spent a couple of hours in the health department talking about the mental health bill which is coming through. And that is going to be really important because a third of people in the mental health system in England and Wales are actually in the criminal justice system. And so that's why it's so important that we work together. And I think some of the points in the bill, for example, prisons should not be a place of safety for someone who is mentally ill. We have a 28-day time limit that we want people to be referred to mental health hospitals. So the only way we can get those done is by working across government. And one of the things that I've been really pleased about is how receptive the other departments are to helping us with our problems.
Great, thank you. Penelope, the government has focused on stabilising the immediate crisis in prisons in the budget and its policy announcements so far. Do you think that was the right call?
They had no choice. I mean, the prisons were getting to capacity, and you can't have a system where people can't, there isn't a prison place at the end of our system. So the early release, to be honest, it seems to have gone pretty well. And the reality is people being released at 40% of their sentence rather than 50% is actually the kind of sentence people used to get 10 years ago anyway. So, and in addition, what's happening in prison is not rehabilitative. So letting them out a little bit earlier if the services are available in the community. The problem we have is something called recall, whereby probation officers, it has to be said, can send people back to prison if they do something, either another crime, which clearly could be reasonable, but also if they don't turn up for an appointment or come back to their hostel after the time they're supposed to. And that recall rate has absolutely skyrocketed. So it accounts for a huge proportion of the prison population. So people who have basically been released and then pushed back again. And that's partly because the services are not as available as they should be in the community to support people who've come out of prison.
Fantastic. I'll come back to you, but I just want to follow up on that point with you, Karen. So I guess we know that there is a lack of these services in the community for both perpetrators and for victims. I guess what do you think are the options or the opportunities to harness community resources in order to help resolve some of the challenges in the criminal justice system?
Yes, so I think there are some good examples of interventions from the domestic abuse sector that are kind of illustrating how some of this could function. So there's an organisation in Sunderland called Find a Way that is trying to kind of reach out and support the community, the informal supporters that may have those eyes and ears within the community that can better respond to the violence and abuse. And they're undertaking a number of different multi-component interventions to educate, to raise awareness, to provide support, to kind of provide that more holistic approach, which hopefully can then, in the longer term, set seed for some kind of more preventative, early intervention initiatives that then have payoffs further down the line.
Fantastic. And coming back to you then, Penelope, we've seen increasing inefficiency in the operation of the courts. So one of the reasons for the backlog growing has been just that we've had more cases coming in than going out, but partly that is a result of increasing inefficiencies, more trials being cancelled on the day, those kinds of problems. What are the steps you think the government could take to improve that efficiency and make sure there's less kind of wastage within the court system?
I mean, efficiency is a big issue, and that's again why I would urge you to go and look at your local magistrates' court. So we did a project where we recruited local volunteers in London to go and watch their magistrates' courts, called Court Watch. And so these were an absolute range of people who were just Londoners who were interested in it. And one of their top observations, which they were deeply shocked at, was what they perceived to be the inefficiency in the magistrates' court. I mean, even just starting. So a lot of the time, it's supposed to start at 10, and you can be sitting there at 11:30, and you've got a room full of very expensive people, but actually no case is ready to go. Efficiency is so complex, but I'll just give two solutions. One is as I said previously, take the bottom out of the magistrates' court so they have a bit more capacity in terms of their own staff, lawyers, etc. They can slow down a bit. The other one is, I don't know if people know, but a lot of delay is caused by prisoners or people who've been in police stations not turning up at the court on time. So the vans are operated privately, procurement, it comes in again here, they arrive late. It can happen in Crown courts, in magistrates' courts. So if you think about a Crown court and a jury sitting there and the cost of that, so they arrive late, and somehow the government needs to put pressure, and this is where James comes in, I think, as well, to put pressure on those private companies to incentivise them somehow to get the prisoner to the court on time, because it makes a huge difference. And of course, to victims and witnesses. And the other one is another one about time, which is that it has to be said that too many defendants don't turn up on court on the day that they're supposed to. Again, talk about digital. We're in the dark ages here in some ways, in that it's all the notices about coming to court are done snail mail, normal post. Now, nobody's reminded on their mobile, nobody's reminded on an email. We're talking about people with immensely chaotic lives, some of whom may not have received this letter in the first place, because a lot of people live in, accommodation where post, is chaotic and it gets lost and so on. So can we have a new system where we actually can get a communication to defendants, even a call, one of those automated calling things that tells them today's your court date, because again, huge wastage there.
Great, thank you. And then lastly, one more question for you, Karen. So you've previously led research projects for the What Works Centre for Crime Reduction. You've done a lot of work on systematic reviews. There's a real hunger for evidence and an understanding of what works in the criminal justice space, in my experience. So how can we improve connections between policymakers and academics to make sure that policy decisions are informed by the most up-to-date evidence?
Well, the College of Policing and UCL have created this fantastic tool called the Crime Reduction Toolkit, which speaks exactly to that need. So this has used systematic review, so it's gathered the best available evidence on crime reduction interventions and undertaken an assessment of that evidence to see whether or not that intervention is deemed to be underpinned by evidence, and you can draw conclusions that that intervention works. And then on the Crime Reduction Toolkit, it's summarised nicely and neatly, trying to speak to practitioners, a broader audience from the criminal justice system that can utilise that evidence and then integrate it into their practice. So yeah, I'd encourage you all to take a look at the Crime Reduction Toolkit, because it has lots of different interventions, and whether or not there's evidence that underpins the effectiveness, whether or not we understand how they're working or why they're working, moderating factors, and of course, if the data is available, it provides economic kind of analysis as well, where it's available. But as we know, that's often not the case. But yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'd now like to open the discussion up to some questions from the floor. Got lots of hands going up straight away. Do keep submitting them online as well. We'll take a few at a time. Again, keep them brief, make sure they're questions. Okay, I'm going to start just in the middle. Gemma.
Thank you. Gemma Buckland from Justice Futures, which is a community interest company. So Penelope emphasised diversion, and Karen talked about the effectiveness of perpetrator programmes, which it would be possible to scale. And my experience of working with the police and crime commissioners has been that violence, including domestic abuse, is out of scope for out-of-court disposals. And the mindsets of victims and the public, so we're told, is that a criminal justice response is necessary and potentially a prison sentence. But that feeds into James's lack of spaces. So we've got a dilemma here between the three of you that feels really tricky to solve, depending on who we listen to. And of course, all of your views are true, have truth. So how do we work through that, is my question.
Great, thank you. And then just in front.
Thank you, Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament and councillor, but that's actually irrelevant to my question, which comes from the fact I have read the book by Rory Stewart and his experience of prison ministers, which, if I may say so, makes what you have to face rather tame, by far less tame than you perhaps are talking about, because he's talking about a whole range of problems, from the conditions, the sanitary conditions, the need for much better training of prisoners, officers, better training of governors, use of drugs, use of drones. I could go on, and he's rather suggesting it is not going to take reform in the short term. Would you agree?
Okay, thank you very much. And then just in the front row here, we've got one.
Christine Ryan, I'm the chair of Ofsted. I have a question about young offenders. You'll not be surprised to know. Young offenders don't have a very good experience once in prison, and that situation hasn't changed for a very long time. Most of those young offenders have also not had a good experience in education. So what appetite does government have, and does it have any new ideas for how we might approach the young offender going forward, rather than just trying to modify what we've had already so unsuccessfully?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we've got the first question about the kind of the scope of diversion and how that can work, and what the tensions are between different priorities. A question on the kind of long-term challenges around prison conditions, training, and so on. And then finally, on young offenders, the kind of appetite to really change the approach there. So I'll do the kind of the same order previously, and just sort of take those ones that you feel you can comment on. James.
Okay, maybe if I answer Robert's question to start with, and we'll see
Yeah.
how we go. I also read Rory's book. I took a lot of notes from Rory's book. I thought it was really interesting, and I've known Rory for quite a long time, and when he was prisons minister, I sat in the chair opposite where I now sit many times, and we had similar sort of conversations around change. And I also agree with you, this is not something that you can do quickly. And one of the things that I'm hoping for is to be able to do this job for a decent amount of time, so I can get things changing in the right direction. From my experience in business, to change anything takes a minimum of 3 years, but really it's after 5 years you feel you're sort of getting there, because it's about culture. and culture takes a long time to change. What is clear is that we've got sort of problems whichever way you look, but there are also opportunities, and there are also lots of great people who will help me do it. A couple of weeks ago I went to Manchester Prison, which just has had an urgent notification. I've been to Manchester Prison probably 10 times over the years. It's my sort of local jail. And there's a sewer that's collapsed, so rats are running around. There's a massive air sort of tower in the middle that's collapsing, so the men can't go in the exercise yards. There's windows broken and cells smashed up that haven't been repaired. So what's clear is, from not just a physical perspective, we need to improve our prisons, but it's also in how prisons are run. And I was fortunate that before I was offered this job, I did a review into prison officer training, which really enabled me to get under the covers of what's going on and what's needed. And also I spent a lot of time with governors and thinking about leadership and how we get things done in prisons and probation as well. So hopefully one of the advantages of now being the prisons minister is I'll be able to ensure that the prison officer training review I did gets implemented. But I'm also aware that I need to pick the ones to really focus on. And those areas are going to take time. And I don't want to be someone who comes in and just does a few things and then job done. For me, what I'd like to do is the person who succeeds me will hopefully have a much easier time than I will have had, because the changes that we need to make, as I mentioned before, I don't want anything to be dramatic and to have the changes that have been in the past, which have actually created a lot of trauma in the organisation. I think it's about listening to people, using the evidence, but understanding that a lot of how a prison operates is about leadership, it's about skills, and it's about people. And yes, we need good processes and good systems and good technology, but we need people who are engaged and passionate about what they're trying to do.
Great. Penelope?
I'd like to say there is an out-of-court programme for domestic abuse, and it's called CARA and is featured in a previous Institute for Government event. And it's run by a voluntary sector organisation, and it's a rehabilitative programme which the police direct people to do when they deal with domestic abuse out of court. Now, you may be shocked to hear about that, but the reality is, go back to my fine, that the majority of people who are convicted in court of domestic abuse-related crimes will be fined rather than get anything rehabilitative. So actually, it's better if people do CARA than go to magistrates' court and get fined. And actually, the CARA evidence base is brilliant. They've really tracked it in terms of reducing offending, and it's got a better evidence base than the programs which are run by probation and the prison service, whereby they haven't tracked the impact of those whatsoever. So there is a possibility there, and the police are very supportive of this out-of-court programme. And the only other thing I want to talk about is youth justice. And I spent 5 years on a project to reduce child and youth imprisonment for the Prison Reform Trust. And it's the unsung success of the criminal justice system. There are about a quarter of the number of children in prison now than there were 15 years ago. And we have had no negative effects for reducing that child prison population. We could do it even more. There are too many children remanded. The disproportionality in terms of ethnicity is pretty shocking, but we've reduced it. And actually, youth justice services who work with children who commit crime are brilliant and are well rated. So there's your success story. It's still the case, though, that the drivers to children committing crime lie, for the most part, outside the criminal justice system, and so we need to deal with those.
Brilliant, thank you. Karen?
I was thinking that, the police and policing do have an important role to play, obviously, in domestic abuse and responding to abuse. And before I came onto the panel, I asked a group of victim survivors that I was working with who I am working with, what their comments would be to share how to improve the criminal justice system from their perspective. And aside from the urgent need for more resources and funding for these types of services and responses, they were focused on adequate training for police, enabling them to be able to listen and recognise abuse. So a lot of abuse isn't being necessarily recognised as domestic abuse unless it's physical violence. So those forms of coercive control are not necessarily being picked up. Victims aren't necessarily being listened to as they might like to be and then appropriately referred. They also wanted to ensure there was kind of like better communication across agencies. So it's not just about, like I said, a criminal justice response, but it's about that cross-sectoral approach, reaching out, engaging with schools, with social services, with the courts, a broader understanding. But I'd also like to say that for some of the victims and survivors, the police is not seen to be a place that their community goes to or reaches out to for help. And I think that is really important to recognise and take a more intersectional approach to see how can we engage those communities that are not necessarily turning to the police for support.
Thank you. I'll take another 3 questions from the room before I come to those of you online. Got one just in the grey jumper.
Hello, Andrew Haldenby, Effective Governance Forum, which looks at management in government. It's a question for the Minister. I was lucky enough to visit HMP Oakwood 3 weeks ago, which you may well know. For those who don't know, the short story is it has a remarkable regime which involves prisoners in the running of the prison. It's superbly rehabilitative. And the point of the story is it costs £17,000 per prisoner against the category C average of £28,000. So it shows how effective management can reduce costs. I wonder how much that example is influencing your thinking.
Great, thank you. And come to the front row here, please.
Thank you. Sam Mercadante from the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. Minister, I don't think my question will come as a surprise to you. Picking up Penelope's point about CARA, I wonder, is government involving the voluntary sector as a strategic partner in understanding what works for these various reform priorities, and if not, why not?
Okay, great, thank you. And just at the very back in the corner.
Thank you. Grace Wild from the Future Governance Forum. I'm interested in the panel's view on the devolution of criminal justice services in the spirit of mission-driven government, and not just from a kind of technocratic perspective, but from more of a like human-centred knowledge of a place perspective. For instance, we have seen a massive reduction in the number of young people in prison, but care leavers are still overrepresented in criminalisation, and their corporate parent is the local authority. So interested in the panel's view on that.
Great, thank you all. So we've got the influence of Oakwood regime on government thinking, and also open to any ideas that either of you would like to share, Penelope and Karen, on that. Involving the voluntary sector as a strategic partner in making policy. And then finally, devolution, what kind of opportunities does that provide, particularly in the context of missions?
Okay. I've sort of come from the voluntary sector, so I still sort of feel in my job I'm sort of the voluntary sector sitting in the minister's office in some ways. So I sort of come at it with hopefully the experience of 20 years in the voluntary sector, and knowing a lot of the organisations. You know, I was chair of Prison Reform Trust for a number of years, and I understand that their role is vital, not just in providing services, but also in holding the MOJ to account, and also providing loads of really good ideas. So one of the things I'm hoping for in the sentencing review is the voluntary sector, and we've already reached out, and they are doing a really good job of feeding in. Some of our best ideas are going to come from the voluntary sector, because we are determined for it to be evidence-led, and the voluntary sector are fantastic on that. I'd also mention one of the great jobs, one of the great things about doing this job is you get to go and see some really interesting things. I will come on to Oakwood in a minute, don't worry. And one of the days I spent was in Birmingham with the Intensive Supervision Court for women. And in the morning, there were women brought up from the cells who were clearly victims themselves. They were battered and they looked very ill women. And in normal circumstances, many of those would have been sent to custody. But with the Intensive Supervision Court, there's a judge who works with them all the way through. So instead of going to prison, they're diverted away and they're getting the support from local government, but also voluntary sector organisations to help them turn their lives around. And so in the morning, you see these women who are clearly very ill and need support. And then in the afternoon, you wind the clock on, and these are women who've been engaging with their sentence and with the voluntary sector in the community. And they look completely different. They walk in confident, virtually hugging the judge, and they've really turned their lives around. So it's clear that it is absolutely vital in more ways than just supporting a service. Oakwood, I'm probably not allowed to say this, but it's my favourite prison. And I've been there a number of times, and I think it's really interesting for a number of reasons. The culture of the place, it feels different. The language is different, but they're locking up the same people that are in Featherstone next door, that has a higher drug testing percentages. And it's sort of, in some ways it appeals to me even more, because the way I ran my business was by trusting my colleagues to run the shops. And what happens in Oakwood is some of the trusted prisoners are given responsibilities to help just some of the day-to-day bits of the prison, for example, gardening and getting prisoners from A to B around the prison. And it really works. And one of the other things that comes from that is a number of prisons have started a thing called Q Branch. It's called different things in different prisons, but essentially it's to help with the maintenance of prisons, because there are lots of people who are locked up in a prison who are actually plumbers, carpenters, decorators and joiners. So rather than sitting in their cells 23 hours a day and walking past bits of the prison that need fixing, why not get them fixing it? So they do that, and obviously they get paid extra for doing it, and they're they're getting their skills improved. And where I've seen that in prisons, it's really effective. So to me, it's around culture. Yep. But no, if you could wave a magic wand, you'd have a lot of prisons like Oakwood.
Great, thank you. Penelope.
I'm just going to talk about the localisation of criminal justice. And I mean, I appreciate what James said about there's been enough traumas in, probation and so on. But actually, the Labour manifesto did give a commitment to look at localising probation. But I think that's just the beginning of a big opportunity, because you could devolve responsibility for courts as well, for all victim services, for witness services. And through doing that, you could devolve the budgets to incentivise the local agencies, whether they be local authorities or the PCC, incentivise them to reduce offending and be able to spend that money on those things outside the criminal justice system, which made the difference to offending. It would be a sea change in how the criminal justice system is operating, but I think it would be a game changer in terms of success for the individuals and society.
Great, thank you. And Karen?
Yeah, really, I suppose my comment is that there is lots of very valuable learning to be gained from some local initiatives. So the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office has just released their own priorities for the criminal justice system reform. And one of them is focused on looking across different localities and trying to do a scoping exercise to better understand examples of good practice and trying to draw from them in order to kind of draw out policy initiatives and strategise. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to take some of the questions that have come in online. I can't actually see who this is from, but the MOJ has estimated 60% of the children of those imprisoned will themselves commit a crime serious enough to be considered for incarceration. What's being done to tackle intergenerational offending? James.
I had a strange upbringing because my parents fostered children, and a lot of the children who live with us because they're parents are in prison, or certainly involved in the criminal justice system. And far too many of them ended up going the same way that the parents went. So to me, it's all quite personal. And the first foster children we ever had, 2 boys called Simon and Sean, I was 9 years old. And they lived with us for about a year, I think it was about a year or a year and a half. So they're very much sort of like brothers, really. And then in those days, we completely lost touch of them. And then my mum died nearly 9 years ago. And I got a letter, because there was an obituary of my mum in the newspaper. And I got a letter off Sean, who was in Liverpool prison. So I ended up recruiting him. And he's had a really difficult life. And I think there are, as we touched on before, this is not just a prison criminal justice problem. It cuts across all parts of how we operate this country, from housing to education to health. But we certainly don't want lots of Sean's, because he was a lovely little boy, talented and bright, but I'm afraid he didn't fulfil his potential. But I sort of personally feel it wasn't his fault.
Mm-hmm. So this one's from Grace Duffy, Bridges Outcomes Partnerships. So earlier, Michael Gove set out the problems of fragmentation of support across criminal justice. Does the panel agree that more personalised, strengths-based support, which joins up the system, is needed, as well as the kind of risk-based approach? I'm actually going to switch up the order here, and I'll come to you, Karen, first, to think about kind of what that personalised, strengths-based support might look like.
Yes. Yeah. So in terms of joining up the different elements of the criminal justice system and tailoring it to the more individual kind of perspective, I suppose I had a PhD student who's now an academic who looked at probation panels and analysed the risk, how we understood those parole boards and the decisions they made, and then subsequently what happened to some of those individuals going forward and reoffending or not. And a lot of his research identified the importance of risk management and being able to recognise what type of offender is likely to reoffend, and the red flags that they're going to send out, and how it's possible to identify those particular individuals. And so as I understood the parole board and the way in which it functions, it's very much kind of tailored towards that kind of like more personalised approach that is, if well-resourced, is able to draw on a wide range of different expertise, and then beyond that going out into the community resources that are available to support that individual and to be able to effectively manage the risk of those individuals. But as I understand it, that does require that more kind of personalised response.
Great, thank you. James, overcoming that fragmentation of support, taking a more holistic and personalised, how can we do that?
I think I probably answered the question with the intensive supervision courts that are on trial at the moment. And when you go there, and I know we need to wait longer term for the evidence to come through, but when you go there and you look at these women and offenders in the other intensive supervision courts, you know that these people need support from lots of different people. And when you get it right, it really makes a difference.
Great, thank you. And Penelope, a question for you. How can criminal court proceedings sort of better interact with family court proceedings, and kind of where sometimes family court proceedings are held up by criminal justice proceedings or vice versa? And is there more that can be done to kind of improve those connections?
You've come back to the silos that were discussed earlier, in that the criminal court and the family court are pretty siloed. I think probably there must be a digital answer, which is to get the information to read across much better. But I think it's always going to be difficult because, if you've got a criminal court proceeding going on, you can't you know, that is on its own trajectory and has got its, as we know, there's huge backlogs. I doubt as one more factor you could speed that up in order to help the family court proceedings. But I do think that the huge kind of divide between the two in terms of systems, communication and personnel can't be helpful.
I'll also come to you, James, on that one. I guess, is that something you're thinking about, how you can align different court systems, or what do you think the challenges are in doing that?
Courts isn't my specific area. No. That's Heidi Alexander's area. Yeah. But what I do know is that certainly in the Crown Court, some of the cases going through are incredibly complex and involve a large number of people. And so that is one of the reasons why our remand population is so high at 17,000. For lots of complex reasons, but yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And we've talked a bit about evidence building, and I've got a question from Tom Gunter from the Behavioural Insights team that is about how can we create more of a widespread culture of being evidence informed so that kind of frontline staff are active participants in kind of evidence gathering, evidence building and applying the evidence.
I think this comes down to leadership.
Yeah.
And the Lord Chancellor has been really clear on the sentencing review that it's going to be evidence-led. And one of the things that when I'm talking to with my colleagues, it's show me the evidence, show me the evidence. I mean, maybe it helps because I've come from business where the reason why you make a decision on whether you're going to open a shop or do something else is based on evidence. And if you can't find the evidence, you don't make a decision. And even if the evidence isn't what a lot of the time the evidence could be goes against what you think is right, but you've got to follow the evidence. Mm-hmm. So I think it comes down to leadership, and I think it's just important that certainly in my role, I keep the team focused on let's not deal with what's happened in the past, let's deal with the evidence that we've got now.
Great. And Penelope, same question, particularly thinking, I guess, about that frontline role in...
I think it's critical, and I hate to say this, but I'm often shocked at the lack of evidence for things that are done in the justice system. And I will come back to these rehabilitation programs. There are what are called offender behaviour programs, which are run in prisons and probation, which have been run for 10 plus years with no impact evaluation. Now, either they could have a backfire effect. There was a sex offender treatment program. I don't know if people remember it, but when they actually did the evaluation, the people who'd been on that program, their offending post-release was actually worse than the people who hadn't been on the program. So we really do need to assess everything. And if we don't have impact evidence, I'm afraid we should abandon it.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much to our excellent panellists. If you could join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much.